ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about Russia. So, two themes to keep in your head whenever we're talking about Russia. One, the concept of backwards, meaning it can't, the country itself cannot keep up with modern society because it keeps shooting itself in the foot. Number two is, of course, Vladimir Putin, which is the representation of Russia since 1999. Okay, first of all, a little demography. Most people consider themselves Russian, even though ethnically, most people, when they see a Russian, it's a Slavic kind of European style Russian. That's what most people see. They don't really notice the Tartars, which are places like Crimea, or the Chechens, or the over 140 different ethnic groups that round like the stands, like Kazakhstan and everything, or that exist in Siberia in Far East Russia. But for the most part, most of all these nations, regardless, consider themselves Russian. And so Russia is a very nationalistic country. The other thing, of course, is the split between, if you notice, surplus female populations as they get older. This is because the life expectancy is one of the largest gaps in the world. For females, it's 75 years. For males, it's 64 years. Primary reason is drug abuse and alcoholism are huge problems within the male population in Russia. Now, of course, we have the war, which is going to kill a whole generation of young males who are fighting in the front in Ukraine. A little bit about religion. Not really a religious country per se, but the Russian Orthodox Church actually has a pretty strong hold in helping develop legitimacy within Russia. It is the unofficial religion of Russia, but not really. I mean, it's basically the official religion of Putin. They really like the idea of culturally traditional social and cultural norms. They do have strong connections with government, and again, it helps strengthen legitimacy. You do have Islam in Chechnya, but Chechnya itself isn't really a religious conflict with Russia. It's more of an ethnic conflict. And of course, part of the reason why Pussy Riot, who is the Putin loyal opposition group here, protested in the Russian Orthodox Church is that they knew that that was kind of a position of power, and it was a definite statement thing to get attention in Russia. Okay, so let's talk about a little Russian history. And by the way, there is a difference between Russia and the Soviet Union, as we're going to see. Early Russian history starts in Moscow. The They were considered really the first, Russians, and they named themselves czars, and they were extremely authoritarian, and they were authoritarian and controlling of their people because of historical precedent. Number one that we need to understand is that um, since 1300, Russia has been invaded over and over and over and over and over again, whether it's the Mongols in China. They've been invaded multiple times from Europe. And so they have a history of being invaded. And to do that, they really look towards strong men. When I mean strong men, I mean like male dominant, hardcore figures. So, um, historical precedent number one, the country has a history of being invaded. And this has developed this idea of what's called the near abroad. And the near abroad is to prevent being invaded by other countries. We need to take over countries and use them almost as borders to protect us. And this is the near abroad. All the Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, these were the former Soviet republics. And then over here, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, those are parts of the near abroad. Again, buffer countries to push out previous invasions into them. The whole point of Ukraine is we don't want this to become a democratic state. We don't want this to become an example of a successful democracy on our border because we'll lose influence in the near abroad, and we want to keep that near and broad for anything that could happen in the future. And so you have this invasion now. Um, and this goes into number two is that Russia has a history of authoritarians because to protect against the invasion and the attack, and because the people themselves can't protect themselves from that. We just have a history, whether you call them the czars, whether it's Stalin, whether it's Putin, you just have this constant authoritarian dictatorial rule over a fairly weak Russian people. And this is why Vladimir Putin is not really seen in a negative light. The blue is the approval rating right here. And if you notice that at one time it got all the way up to almost 90% approval at some points in terms of overall history. It now has dipped. The lowest dips were the 2012 elections. And then right here, which is this low dip right here, is right before the invasion of Ukraine. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin became way more popular and is now around 87%. This is legitimate, by the way, popularity. The Levada Center in Russia is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, actual information institution, and still Vladimir Putin is very popular. Um, if we go back into the 18th century, we have Peter the Great, who travels around the West, introduces Western technology and culture to Russia. He travels to Germany, England, Holland, looks at architecture, looks at the navies, and what the Western czars like Peter the Great end up creating is this historical preference that Russia wants to actually be an influence in the world. They want to have a say at the global table. So they work from the 18th century onward at not only just being able to prevent invasion, but to also influence what is going on within the Eastern Hemisphere and then hopefully around the world as a global power. And now, to do this, of course, they need to make sure that any kind of suppression in at home is contained. So you're not going to need to know about the Decembrist revolt of 1825, that it's crushed by Tsar Nicholas I, but how he does it, he actually sneaks in members of the government into these organizations, the Decembrist group that was trying to revolt against the government. And this historical precedent comes about that Russia uses secret police extensively to make sure that um, that opposition groups and organizations, and also in foreign countries, a lot of secret police and spies, the KGB, the GRU, that on countries abroad trying to influence their elections, a lot of nefarious propaganda and eating out organizations from the inside to make them and keep them weak. And now, under Vladimir Putin, you have what is known as the FSB, the Federal Security Service. And the FSB is basically, Putin's private police force slash military. He needs a group around him that he knows he can depend on, that are going to enforce his will, not even necessarily the will of the country. And so he keeps the FSB around him as a method of maintaining power. It's that group. It's not the military. It's almost like his personal security service that is loyal ultimately to him. They end up crushing his opposition. They enforce his will. So that's the secret police now. We have the Russian Revolution, where the czars are overthrown. You have a couple of causes here: the defeat of the Russians to the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. In World War I, the Russians, we're doing cavalry charges against machine gun nests against the Germans. They didn't really have any guns, no food, no shoes. And so you get this mass defection and eventually the Russian Revolution, which causes mass amounts of death. And here's a historical precedent that's really important to understand. Russians have been through a whole lot of pain. Throughout time, Russians have been through hard times. And so they almost look at the hard times, whether it's the revolution or Stalin or the fall of the wall, shock therapy. They look at it and go, this is who we are, kind of in terms of history. And so they're willing to go through a lot of pain because it's just kind of who they have been throughout their entire time. This brings us to communism and what communism is, and to understand not only Russia but China, you got to understand where communism comes from and its philosophy. People often get communism and Marxism kind of mixed up. Basically, Marxism is the philosophy behind communism, and the communism is the type of government. So, Marxism is a political philosophy defined by Karl Marx in a book known as the Communist Manifesto. If you're all interested in history or economics or politics, you should definitely read the Communist Manifesto. Most colleges were going to require that you do so anyway. Okay. It is a response to the Industrial Revolution. And people don't realize it came out in 1848. And like the whole Red movement doesn't really impact the United States until the early 1900s. So it was around for quite a while before it became influential. His theory was basically everybody is born equal into a tribal communist kind of society. Eventually, the strong come together and take over the weak. This creates imperialism. And then over the course of time, you break society into certain strata where once you're born there, you're never going to be able to rise up, in terms of social mobility. This is the concept of feudalism. And then over time, feudalism isn't going to work. And so you're going to get into where you pay the worker a very meager amount. This creates capitalism. You will hear a lot in college the concept of late stage capitalism. That's this theory that we're to the point to where we'll turn into a more socialist type society. And eventually, all barriers, the state, all private ownership of anything, all religion breaks away, and you create a true communist system where everybody is communal and equal. That's his theory. Okay. And of course, capitalism is bad because most of the people, the proletariat down here, do all the work. And the wealthy people, the military, religion, and eventually the kings, presidents, and prime ministers are all basically the bourgeoisie as they are seen. They own all the factors of production when the ones that actually do all the work are the proletariat. And so communism's idea is that, the workers, they suffer, but the bourgeoisie, they benefit. Now, what does Marx get right? Well, capitalism does create inequality. It does. The businesses do attempt to exploit the workers, and free markets to create boom and bust cycles. He predicted globalization and that the corporations would monopolize the market. And he was right that wealthy people ultimately make decisions that affect them. But what he got wrong is, of course, egalitarianism fails to ever materialize, that economic growth in communism is very limited, that a whole lot of people died during communist regimes, and that more than anything else, the poor don't want to actually overthrow the wealthy. The poor actually want to become wealthy. They want to join the wealthy. So, what government comes out of this? We'll see next time.